Following is an insightful presentation featuring Dr. Bernard Sama's groundbreaking research. Dr. Sama explored the use of therapeutic jurisprudence in examining how the government's refugee and protection status determination process can be improved to better safeguard the health and the well-being of both asylum seekers and the practitioners who support them.
Thank you all for coming here today. Besides me as a researcher, I am also the chair of the Asylum Seekers Support Trust. I have been, in the past 5 years, also very active in the refugee people from forced migrants and refugee background community. I've been the chair as well of ARCC, and I can see Avan there. Thank you for being here today, Avan. And I also have several other colleagues here that are board members and former board members. But for the interest of time, I will not list those members. So me, Bernard Sama, as a person, I think I'll take this off if that's okay. Yeah. So as a person, I am from this part of the world. That is the map of Africa, and I'm from this country that is in red. That's Cameroon. That's my home country, and Cameroon is one of the countries that in around 1950s, when Africa was asking for independence, it's one of the countries that I'll call an unfortunate experiment was created in this country, because what the United Nations did was that it brought together a people who some were former French colonies, a former French colony, and another part that was former British colony. He brought these two people together to form this country, Cameroon. So this is the map of Cameroon, and the part of Cameroon where I come from is this part, this small part here, and that is the part that speaks English, former British colony. But then 80% of the country is French speaking. And for us, that's become the reason why today there is a conflict in Cameroon, and there's been a crisis over 50 years. It's never been violent, because as a people, even though we are all Africans, but given our colonial history, we cannot agree to live together in peace. And the reason is because this part of the country where I come from is very rich in terms of crude oil and other natural resources, whereas most of this part up here is dry, leading up to northern Africa. If we see Sahel region up, so it's dry, it doesn't have much of the cash crops that are here. So our brothers here don't manage us as a people that deserve to have a right, because they want access to the resources, not us. So that caused persecution. I trained back home in Cameroon as a lawyer, and I was working in Cameroon doing human rights work. And due to my job and my support for this part of the country to have some kind of autonomy from the rest of the country, that brought me into persecution. And finally, with the help of foreign intervention, I was able to come to New Zealand and settled here, and was applied for asylum and was recognized as a refugee. And that's where my journey also starts as a researcher, because when I went through the Refugee Status Determination process, I came from a background where I had studied law, and I understood quite clearly what the law is, even in the context of how it should operate in New Zealand, because the same principles that I use in New Zealand, not in terms of the principles of the law, but the general way how we should understand, interpret the law as it's done in New Zealand, is the same thing that obtains in that part of the country, because we are also a former British colony, and we cite a lot of British cases, as is in the case in New Zealand. If there's going to be, the case can persuade the judge to change his mind or make a decision that helps. So So I understood that. But what shocked me when I went through the refugee status determination process in New Zealand was that despite that I had come from that background, as someone who studied law and understood this process, it was really extremely challenging. I had a 2-day interview. For me, at that time, I thought it's because, of course, I'm a lawyer, so what do you expect? They're not going to give me a 1-day interview. But after I had completed the process, I met other people in the community that came after me around 2010, 2011. Some of them barely could speak English, some were not as educated as me, and they were having 2-day interviews. And I thought, okay, this doesn't sound right, because for a process like that, it's not really designed to achieve what it's intended to do. So we can go to the next one. So, that one, thank you. So based upon that, I decided to say, okay, I would like to do research in this area to be able to find out how could we conduct or help the law to achieve its purpose in a way that is safe and it's better. It doesn't hurt and harm people. Because for me, at some point, it was traumatizing or re-traumatizing having to go through a 2-day interview and ask questions about experiences that I thought were not even related to my claim, but it became the point of the focus. So I used this theory of that has been developed by some American scholars. So they say our duty as, say, a people, whether it's judges, lawyers, psychologists, whatever field you are in, our duty is, even as teachers, is that you look at the law or policy that affects or relates to that area where you work. You also look at the policy, the processes and the practices, including even our own practice. We should examine that, and if we see that whatever there is about the law or is about the processes or a practice, whatever about those processes that affect people adversely, which was not intended by the law, then we can advocate or find ways through looking at other social sciences how that process could be changed. So that's what informed my lens to do a PhD. And for my PhD, then I looked at the refugee status determination process in New Zealand. That is the asylum process. When asylum seekers come to this country, from the time they arrive at the airport to the point where they receive their decision, the law, the process, and the practice of the lawyers, decision makers, and all of that, how is it affecting them? Is it helping them to perform well in this process, or actually harming or preventing them from achieving the purpose that is intended? And one thing I haven't said also is that the theory also says we should critique the law itself, because sometimes the problem can be the law. So if it's a problem is the law, then we have to make recommendations for the law to be fixed, so to be reformed. So for my PhD thesis, I interviewed 32 persons in total. There were 12 asylum seekers, former asylum seekers, and then 20 professionals who work in the refugee status determination process. Among the professionals were 3 interpreters, 2 psychologists, a psychotherapist, a social worker, support worker. But these other professionals were also what surprised me, because when I decided to do this study, I did not think the people that actually work as refugee status determination officers will be interested to participate in it. And that's because for me as an asylum seeker, we have a lens that we see them. These are the people that try to stop us from, getting a better life in this country. So why would they want to participate in this study? But I was shocked that when I advertised my study, the Immigration and Protection Tribunal, 5 members actually opted to participate in the study. Then the Refugee Status Unit, formerly the Refugee Status Branch. They declined to participate in the study, but I think the reason is obvious. But however, one former employee from that unit accepted to participate in the study. And then 6 lawyers that are very experienced in this area also participated. So I got some very rich data from there. Yeah, thank you. So from there, I collected the data, interpreted it, analyzed it. And for our talk today, thinking about what I could talk about, because the law says, or the theory, therapeutic jurisprudence says, look at the law, look at the process, look at the practice, look at what the adverse effects of those 3 aspects, and wherever something is harmful, make suggestions about changes. So for me, today I decided that we would talk about the pressure cooker metaphor. And through that, we will look at how we can address the pressure points in New Zealand Refugee Status Determination through using empathy, what I call empathy in action, and psychological first aid. Okay, yeah, you can go to that. Just to get us started on that, I would like to read this quote from one of my participants in my study. She was a social worker, and she said, I see this process take place, and I see mental health begin to decline. And depending on how long the process takes, will show what that looks like. So the type of things that I will witness is people, it starts maybe issues around sleep, then there is issues with boredom and time just passing by, and so the mind getting really busy. That feeling into greater issues with sleep, need for medication. I have had to call an ambulance from home at 10 p.m. at night for someone who's overdosed on too many pills because they just don't want to wait anymore. They've had enough. I've mopped up blood from people who have cut themselves, because when everything is feeling emotionally so hard and there doesn't feel like there is any outlet for that pain, cutting themselves has seemed like the best solution or a way to elevate the focus on that. So for me, this last sentence here, when everything is feeling so emotionally so hard, then people's got to find a way to let that pain or stress, emotional pain out. So that's what led me to think about the pressure cooker metaphor. So what I'll be going through now is take us through some of what are, based on the data of my thesis, are the pressure points for people that traverse this process as asylum seekers in New Zealand. The very first one is what we all know, it's obvious. Many people come here to seek asylum or refugee status or as refugees because there is a background. They're running from something. So that is the pre-existing wounds or the wounds that they already have in them before they even arrive in New Zealand. So it could be conflicts like what we see in Gaza, could be persecution, torture, human rights abuses. But beside the trauma that they will experience directly from that, they will also experience trauma from the process of migration. Like the audio you played before, the guy that was on the boat traveling to Australia. But more also, they will experience loss. Many people back home like me, I was a lawyer working, had a life, opportunities. Suddenly, I became disconnected from all of that. Support network, family, friends. So that initial background has already put me on edge before I even arrive. I'm already edgy by the time I'm arriving New Zealand airport. Okay, good. But then, what happens when I arrive from the airport if we all agree that, if you're from refugee background, this is the kind of context we're coming from? One of the reasons why people choose a country like New Zealand is often from what they've heard, seen, or been told. New Zealand sort of has this optics. If you're out, it's a beautiful country, it's safe. If you watch how Maori are able to express themselves about the issues that affect them, a lot of people here take that for granted. But if you ask many of us from refugee background, that's the reason why we become refugees, just by speaking out. Going in front of the parliament to say, hey, we want maybe access to this land, or we're not happy with the way you're treating our Bokos, or this very kind of core things. But here we take them for granted because, again, we've never had the opportunity to be back in those places to see that. So for us, when we are coming here, we sort of have this background that it's a safe place, and that when I arrive at the airport and claim asylum, I'll be protected, looked after. But I have that title, the hypocritical hospitality. Reason for that is because the notion that is safe, but when we arrive and we actually claim asylum, often the treatment does not reflect that. And I'm not saying every asylum seeker is treated in a bad way. But again, you have to report the good, the bad. So for many people that are interviewed, or some of the asylum seekers that are interviewed, including even the lawyers, the stories that they told me about the experiences of their clients at the airport was not good. There were clients that were told that they will be detained and a way will be fine to send them back to wherever they're coming from. Could you imagine someone that has just landed, knows no one, is really scared, and that's what he's being told, that we'll find a way to send you back. Or there's a woman that arrived with children, you can go to the next. A woman that arrived with kids, and she was given no food, no support whatsoever, and she had to undergo this interview. So the welcoming at the airport is not good. And if we think about the pressure cooker, that person initially was already edgy because they're running from trauma or something. Then now the welcoming from at the airport is not good, so it's added to that level of stress. So the next thing is, unfortunately for some people in this group, if they have issues like with their identity, maybe they are not able to, they may have destroyed their passport based on how they got into the country at the airport, so they claim asylum. And under the law, it says they have to be detained. But we have, as a country, an immigration act that has put processes that the court should follow to be able to review the detention. So unlike my country, that if you landed in my country and we don't want you, you go straight to prison. New Zealand, you may still end up in that prison, but the difference is that they'll say you go through this legal process. And as a country, what we know is that the court is supposed to be for justice. But unfortunately, the way the law in the Act has been written does not really allow the judges to be able to do their job. So they just rubber stamp. Because currently, as we speak, the law, the way it still is, because it hasn't been reformed, even though the government is committing to changing that, it gives the border officials or the immigration officer, whoever has made the application, they got a stronger, whatever they say, the judge has to accept. Sort of the way the burden of proof has been written. So that's one of the issues, that the process at the district court, just rubber stamping. But what we also know is that for asylum seekers, if they go through their initial claim at the Refugee Status Unit and it's not successful, they go through the IPT, again, it's not successful, they have a right to appeal. But the fact, again, is how many can actually afford and succeed in that appeal. And I know the argument, when I was going through my data, I had a conversation with my supervisors, they said, but it would look appropriate that the law shouldn't just be too relaxed so that everyone can be putting claims. like appeal, then the High Court will be flooded with cases. And I said, while that is, if we look in the context of New Zealand, right, even me and you here as citizens of this country, if we wanted to go to the High Court, it's not easy. You need a lawyer, and not just any lawyer, a lawyer that is familiar with that process, and it will cost money. While that is okay for us as a citizen, but let's think about someone whose life is potentially in danger, right? So if we get it wrong, they can go back to a country where they will be hurt, or they will be killed, or they will be imprisoned for life. So, and that's why I think the threshold for asylum seekers to be able to access the High Court and all of that should not be the same like ordinary citizens, because their situation for an ordinary citizen, it might just be loss of liberty, or it might just be something about maybe getting some compensation, a civil claim. But when it comes to loss of life or torture, the burden, the opportunity that people should be able to have to access the court should not be that hard. But the law makes it quite difficult for asylum seekers to be able to access, and even when they do, the judges at the High Court, at this court level, they are not really interested. They often just defer, go back to whatever the reasoning of the IPT was. So they just say the IPTs, like one of the lawyers told me, the IPTs got about 30 years plus of doing this. So they understand the refugee law than me as a judge. So why would I be looking at it? So I'll just go back to their reasoning. So yeah, that aspect. And then the next aspect. So because asylum seekers are not able to, they go through this rubber stamping process, it adds to the stress, right? So the next one is for those who are detained, again, those that arrive at the airport and do not have proper identities, or even those that are in the country then claim asylum sometime later, they will end up being detained in police cells and prisoned. And without even explaining much about that, what we know is that prison is not a place for someone who is seeking asylum, and there's been a lot of psychological and physical harm that has been reported about prison or police cells used for detention. Amnesty International did the report 2 years ago that was really exposed that, and that forced the government to be able to commit to changing this aspect of the law. But again, for the people that have this experience, it adds up to the pressure that they're experiencing. Yeah, and next. And this other part, thank you, Christina. She's spoken to that. Difficulty for those that are in the community assessing welfare, whether it's through MSD or getting IRD number, those challenges. For the people that are in the community, they don't have a home, you're new to New Zealand, don't know anyone, but then there is a timeline, they have to wait for their confirmation of claim to come. But at that time, they get no support. Again, it adds to that context of the pressure on them here. Yeah. And besides that, what we also know, which Christina, I think you pointed out, was often the discourse in the media about asylum seekers is not friendly, especially when it's coming to when the government has to reform the law, like what we saw recently during the review of the mass detention law, as well as, but it was quite noticeable in New Zealand around 2012, 2013, when the government actually introduced this law that says if people arrive here on a boat, technically that's what it means, but it just says if people arrive more than 30 on any fleet, but if immigration can put all of them together and say, hey, even though you came individually, but you actually belong to this group of 30 people, then they'll end up in prison. But during that time, there were really some negative discourse that politicians used. They will use names like queue jumpers, potential boat people and all of that. So that also adds to the kind of feeling that we have that this place is not welcoming, but increases the stress for us moving to the role of lawyers, which is another very interesting one that came up from my study, is that typically lawyers, as we know them in the context of a traditional legal setting or judicial system, is that lawyers, almost like what we see in the Hollywood, they have to defend you. They argue in front of the judge, they pull your evidence, they do everything to fight for you. As most of my clients use the word, the people that are interviewed, use the word, they fight for you. But the refugee status determination process is not designed for lawyers to work that way. And it's a good thing, it's not a bad thing. It's designed to be an inquisitorial process, non-adversarial. So it means the lawyer would not be challenging everything, because that everything that the decision maker is saying, he will not be acting up like he's in court, because then it becomes quite confrontational. And the reason why the process is non-adversarial is because that confrontation, usually it causes a lot of stress and distress to people who are in that setting. So, but what we have at issue here is that because it's been designed to be inquisitorial most of the time, even though it can also be adversarial if the tribunal chooses to use that pathway. But for many asylum seekers, what they see is that they see a lawyer that is just there, like what we call an armchair lawyer, that is not representing them. So the lawyer might be doing his work, but because they have not taken time maybe to explain this process to the client, really get the client to understand fully the differences, because they're also overloaded with work. Legal aid rates at the time I did the study was quite low. I think it's gone up now. So the clients really, the asylum seekers feel really disappointed with the role of some lawyers, not all of the lawyers, some of the lawyers that they were just, actually they call them editors. They just, I write everything, they edit, and when they went to the interview, the lawyer never said anything. And some of their discourses was supported by even the tribunal members and RPOs. They cited cases of lawyers that have come to interviews and fallen asleep. And, a couple of times, not one time, not two times, or make a submission such that they put a submission together that does not even address the point. So it's almost like they carry a bin bag full of material and then dump it for the RPO to go through and sort the material or the decision maker. So these things, if you imagine if that person is a client and their only hope that they are looking at is a lawyer, and then this is what the lawyer is appearing to them, it adds to their stress. Okay, and yeah, we can go to the next. I think I will, anyway, I'll read this quote for one of my clients because it's short. So one of the claimants said this, he said, "I just feel sometimes the lawyers here are just toothless bulldogs. They don't seem to speak out, or they don't seem to query or question the RSD, that is RSU today, officials conducting the interview. They don't seem to be that kind of lawyer that would challenge the officials. A lawyer should be able to speak out, defend your client, not supporting the crown. They seem to give so much allegiance to the crown." But again, this is because where these people are coming from, their notion of what a lawyer should be or is not what the RSU is designed to. RSD is designed to function that way, yeah. So to the next, we just skip that one. You can skip that, yeah. It's all right. Or if you want, yeah. So the other part that also stresses the client, causes adverse consequences, is how many asylum seekers perceive these decision makers, more particularly those at the Refugee Status Unit. One of the very first problems is that the Refugee Status Unit is a unit in Immigration New Zealand. So it's part of Immigration in New Zealand, as seen by the claimant's perspective. And when asylum seekers go there and ask questions about their claim forward, backward in different ways. All it appears to that person is that this person is an immigration officer. But what we do know is, I hope that is not my phone. sorry. Yeah. But what we do know is that RSU officials are not immigration officials. They have a different function clearly stated and spelled out in the Act, and they cannot even do both. The law does not. Well, they could if they want to breach the law, but the law says quite clearly that they cannot be a refugee and protection officer and also work as an immigration officer. But unfortunately, because the RSU is still a unit under INZ, Immigration New Zealand, and when people arrive at the airport, sometimes the interview, even about the asylum claim, is done by immigration officers, not by RSU officers, as the law says, or customs officers. The interview may also even be done by customs officers. So it creates all this mind that these people, as one of the lawyers said, have a Coast Guard mentality. So their duty is like, we don't have that in Australia, in New Zealand, but in Australia, I think that would relate more where they have boats roaming around the ocean looking for any potential boat that might come into Australia, and then they're protecting the Australian coast and will push them back out. So, but we don't have that here, but the lawyer described that from the claimant's perspective, or even from the lawyer's perspective, they do sometimes come across as that. Yep, okay. To the next, thank you. So Christina spoke about this one, the long waiting times, whether it's from when the claim is lodged to when the decision is made. It creates all sorts of problems, whether it's anxiety, suicidality, hopelessness, and these different problems that when people are waiting long for this claim, it causes. And I have a feeling that it might get worse now because the current estimate is showing that the claims are around 2,500 this year, and it may go up. So that means people might wait longer, except the RSU and IPT will have to, or the government will have to put in a lot of resources, recruit more people. So, but then it means we could be seeing more, an organization like RAS could be seeing more of claimants that are really destabilized. Yeah. So the other aspect is, which is sort of the last one in terms of the adverse effect, is what are called inhospitable interview skills, environment or atmosphere at the RSU and IPT. In a nutshell, is that a refugee status determination claim, what I see from my perspective, and maybe the lawyers might think differently or the decision makers, but from my experience, it's the interview. You can have a good claim well written on a paper. I can get any of you here to write me a claim. So that's how I think they see it. But if I go there for an interview and I cannot be able to express and explain that, then it's not my claim. So the interview is the backbone to this process. But again, that same interview, New Zealand, if we look at other Western countries, let's say UK, US, Canada, even Australia, that we could compare New Zealand to some extent, or even Europe. Interviews are interviews here, even though there's been some change in the past 4 or 5 years, where the RSU now has 4 hours or so interview, or maybe 3.5 for one day, and then they come another day and finish another 4 hours. But it used to be, like in my case, it was 7 hours straight, but I had breaks, and then the next day the same 7 hours straight. I don't know if the IPTs changed that process, but at the time I interviewed them in, that was 2021, when I interviewed them for my thesis, they were still having like 7 hours interview long, but they have breaks in between. But what we know is that these interviews, and for some people this can be 2 days, And it can be really traumatic because they ask everything. It's almost like a lens, a laser through your life, whatever they can ask, they will ask. So besides it being long, it's also, there is a culture based on how they ask the questions, what questions they ask, how they go forward and come back. It shows that they are coming from a culture of disbelief, complete disbelief. So you have to really say the things, keep thinking about it, because they can come back to anything. It's interrogatory, and also there is some disconnection in cultural perspectives. Because the way I might be, say for instance, an African, ask a question to a fellow African could be different if you have someone from a mainstream that asks that same question. It can cause, the person can be angry about something that they shouldn't have been if only we knew how to ask those questions in a way that is culturally appropriate. So this disconnection can, for many people, cause problem. And sometimes the IPT members that were really generous to participate in my study, I remember I think one or two said they were surprised that they asked a very simple question, but the client, the appellant, became really, really upset. And unfortunately, when the IPT member was talking to me about that, interestingly, I knew this client and I knew his issue because the lawyer that I had gone to do my study with the lawyer, the client was there. So the lawyer talked to me and said, this is this client, this is the situation that your client is going through, the kind of inappropriate question that was asked. And that environment too, where they go for their interview, can be really unwelcoming for people. Because we're talking about a population group that sometimes they will not have the basic necessities. Let's say food, they might not. Rice would have those kind of cases. Abantu would have come across many asylum seekers that, either homeless, we see them every day at ASST, that don't have a food, but yet they have to go for an interview. They don't have a house, they have to go for an interview. So imagine turning up for an interview that you spend 7 hours or 8 hours and you haven't eaten, you don't even have a house. How can you perform well in that interview? It just doesn't add up. And at the time I did my study, I particularly asked some of the decision makers or lawyers so in that case, what would they do? Is there do they have some vouchers or something that if someone was going to come to an interview and is homeless or didn't have food, would they have some food there for that person? One of the members said even though it's not accepted, ethically, but she's had to sometimes pull money out of his own pocket, give the client, give an appellant to go and eat, which means the institution does not have food or sometimes basic hygiene for. You could imagine a woman that some kind of questions can traumatize you and you suddenly have an unexpected period, something like that. And this kind of things, one of the ladies that I interviewed told me about it, and I asked her, what did you do? She said, well, she just deal with it, and that provision was not there. So all of these things that I've spoken about, because that's what that theory says, we should look at the law, the process, the practice, and try to identify the things that don't go well, and then see how we can suggest change. But I want to acknowledge that there are also issues, things that some of these officers did very well. So we'll go to the next slide. So here, before I go to that, I've spoken about how this process can affect asylum seekers adversely, but it doesn't end with them. The lawyers that are interviewed, the IPT members that are interviewed, interpreters, psychologists, they had I was actually concerned for some of them. And I'm not surprised that some of them actually have left their job because they experience, the next one, vicarious or secondary trauma from the stories of the clients that they hear and see, and without the support, they I think I may have, go to next, let's see. Oh, it's not there, but Anyway, that's all right. But yeah, they do experience a lot of nightmares. They describe wake up at night or driving home crying, or just walk out of the interview, take time. So it's not about the clients. They also go out and cry, or the decision makers, they hide it in front of the client because they don't want the claimant to see. But then they ask for a break and they go to their office and really cry it out because it's quite traumatic, the stories they hear and all of that. So the impact of this is not only on the asylum seekers, but it's also on the decision makers and the people that work directly with them. So we can go to the next. So then how do we manage all of this, which is the part that I was required to sort of look at as a researcher. And one thing that I learned to do is that I have been in New Zealand for some time, and New Zealand is a very civilized country, but something that I also noticed that we are good at doing is that we're good at shifting blames, right? If I stand here today and say the problem is the law, what's going to happen? It means if there are any decision makers here, let's say RSU, IPT, they will say, it's not my problem. It's the law. We have to fix the law to be able to fix that problem. So that was one of the challenges that I had for my studies, that I have to really look at it critically to be able to find out how this can be a shared responsibility. Yes, there are aspects about the law that are not good that we need to change, but what can we do differently to be able to make this process in a way that is safer and better for people? And I thought about this, read about empathy in action and psychological first aid. These are big words and can mean different things in different contexts. But in the context of this refugee status determination process, in the context of refugee status determination, these are some of the things these are some of the things that I think if we do them differently, it would make the process easy for asylum seekers. And I actually really liked what this tribunal member, and he's one of the very experienced, and he tends to write some of the very, like the president's decisions at IPT. And I don't know if I would do it justice to read it, but he was talking about empathy, what I call empathy in action here. He said it's just making sure that people are approaching the task with empathy, And personally, I take the view that even if we don't believe someone telling us the story is credible or not, at the end of the day, at worst, that person has tried to come to New Zealand to have a better life for themselves because they come from a slum in Bangladesh or wherever. I mean, what would we do? We did the same thing in the issues, no doubt, probably. So I think having that basic understanding that at worst, that's what's going on with these people or with those people, that's an absolute, almost worst case scenario. What's going on at a human level, and to have that basic empathy. We do believe it is super important to have them just be aware through the way in which you manage the hearing, that you have that empathy. I think it is important. So why he made this last sentence is because he's almost in a managerial position. So he's talking now about making sure that as a supervisor, he gets or she gets the staff that work under him to be able to understand that empathy is important. But I found what he said really important, or she said, because he's not saying that we have to approve everyone that comes through the door, but let's have some empathy in the way we treat them, because even if they are not refugees, or as we as in New Zealand, by our standard, they are here for just to get a better life. And if we have to decline them, we can still do it in a human way. So you get to the next, yeah. So, but beyond or putting our context, practicality in terms of empathy in action and psychological first aid. One of the very first things we have to do is look at the law. There are certainly aspects of the law that will need to be reformed for this process to be safe. First one, the government has done some work on that and is still doing. Detention in criminal justice facilities needs to stop in every way possible. We've seen the government has moved to review the law on mass arrival, that is the people that will be more than 30, but there is still the aspect that actually affects asylum seekers that has not been touched. The people that come individually and claim for asylum, that we have many in the community, so that aspect needs to be changed. Also, there's been in the past 2 years or so improved legal aid rate, but I don't know how that has translated to refugee lawyers in particular, because I did the interview for this study before the government improved that legal aid. And then another thing that will help that the government could do to make sure that the RSU is not being perceived as part of Immigration New Zealand is make it an independent body. And we have systems like that. In Canada, the refugees, the whole process about refugees is not linked to immigration. So there are examples that the government can follow from that. And then also, as Christina had indicated, there's also some reform that needs to be done in terms of policies and practices, whether it's at MSD or IRD, to make it easier for people to access welfare support. Yeah. Go to the next. Yeah, thank you. And in terms of the border, before I said our border can be have this hypocritical hospitality. So what do we need to do to be able to make it safe for asylum seekers? It's basic assurance. It's a legal process that we've signed up to this treaty to say we can offer people protection. So if they do come and ask for protection, it's providing them information about their rights, providing them information about services that they can access in the community, but also telling them about their responsibilities. If your claim is declined, then you are expected to leave New Zealand or you'll be deported. So all these things needs to be incorporated such that it becomes a process that it's quite clear, and whether it's custom officers or immigration officers know what to do, or there is an office there that they can send that person and they'll get this information. Because what some of the lawyers told me is that sometimes the immigration officers or custom officers that do interview people initially had no knowledge really of what the Refugee Convention is about, and that's why they say some of those things that they do say. So we can change that, right? So the next, and then in terms of the decision makers and IPT, that is including even the lawyers. So this decision makers at RSU, IPT members, is shorter interview and waiting times. But of course, we know that we can't do that for every case. There might be cases where the interviews, the waiting time for the decision could be long, but this can be determined on medical grounds. And then the forms, application forms that claimants use could be made much easier, maybe fillable electronically, and treat claimants with empathy and dignity, as the tribunal member said before. Even when they are going to be declined, we can still do that in a professional way and still decline them. But another important point is clear and upfront explanation, by lawyers, and both the lawyers and the decision makers. I think one of the things that I really picked from this is that asylum seekers get really confused about the role of lawyers, what the lawyers can do and they cannot do, and all of that in this process. So if they have a very clear explanation of the role of lawyers, including even decision makers, that helps to improve that process, for them. And then the hearing environment needs to be more claimant suited and with the basic necessities that they need, but also the interviewing skills by the decision makers or even lawyers need to be non-intimidating or threatening, non-threatening, and non-harassing, because some of the clients say that, I felt harassed in the interview or intimidated. Clear, short, and concise questions with enough time to respond. Avoid unnecessary repetitions. And, just the culture of disbelieving everyone is not good for the process. And they should follow advice from the psychologists, clinical staff, or health professionals, in terms of how the interview is structured. And another thing that came up in the study was how make better use of psychologists in this process. Incorporate more psychologists in the interview if needed, in cases, especially in cases where the claimant is vulnerable. Currently, maybe there's been some change on IPT. I don't know about that, but at the time I did this study, interviews would go to 4 p.m. or something like that. But the problem with that is that if someone was leaving this interview and they've been affected, traumatized or something, they don't have a means of getting help. So if interviews can end maybe around 3, it might allow them to see a RAS clinician if that's possible. Even the lawyers too need it, because if lawyers were talking to me and crying, and some of the decision makers too were also affected, so it means they too also need help. It's not only about the asylum seeker. So but beyond that, there are very good trauma-informed interviewing skills that decision makers and lawyers can use. There is something that like gentle confrontation. So you could be confronted, ask questions that are challenging, but in a way that is safe. And I've seen articles on that actually give examples of those kind of questions, or how the judge or lawyer could ask those kind of questions. Genuine curiosity, empathetic. This concept about genuine curiosity, actually one of my clients one of the people that I interviewed pointed that out, because he was from the LGBT background, and he felt like some of the questions that he was being asked, there was no need. It was not genuine. It was more, so genuine curiosity, empathetic listening, de-escalating the interviewing techniques, de-escalating interviewing techniques, cultural responsive interviewing, narrative interviewing. So there are a whole lot of this kind of skills. And I think RAS does some training with RSU and IPT on that. So so this last bit, which is where I am excited about, because I felt like this is something that actually came out of my thesis more. But even though I've just written it in a funny way, but I think that they should, relax a bit from this. Typically in the Western context, or even in my background where I come from, we could have people that, because they are in administrative or decision-making processes, they can be so much in a straight jacket kind of attitude. They need to relax a little bit and just practice some, what we call, I think for the health professionals here, we know about boundary violations and boundary crossing. So there's a big debate around that. Boundary violations is when you as a professional, you might step and do something to the client that actually hurt or harm the client. But sometimes we have these ethical codes and other things that we can say, for instance, like the IPT member that told me she has in the past given her money to claimants who hadn't eaten to go and eat, because before they start the interview, she asked, have they eaten or something? They said no. And then she thought, but how am I going to interview for 12 hours, for 7 or 6 hours if you're hungry? So she gave them money. So if you look in their, maybe in their professional code or these things, he might say they are not to give that money to the claimant. But a boundary crossing would be something like that is safe to do to help the client perform meaningfully well in that process. So other things would be like a modest and genuine cultural appropriate greeting, a hospitable waiting room with refreshments or some kind of vouchers for those who don't have food, basic hygiene parts for those who might need it in places where say if there are females or other people that might need it, yeah. Nice. And can I see the next slide? That's take time. Okay, sorry, I'm not gonna read that. Just go back to the other one before. So this point that I have here sort of brings me to the end of what I am proposing or suggesting, that these are some of the things that if we do, they would come up to what we might call empathy, having empathy in action. So we're doing things in a way that help people to be safe, or maybe what we also call psychological first aid. And the reason why I choose to use the psychological first aid is because if I tell, say, decision makers or even lawyers that they should look at this process as psychologists, they will say they are not psychologists, they are not psychiatrists, so why should they be really going deep to provide some kind of intervention for people, because they are not trained. But what we know about first aid is that any of us here can do first aid. So if we look at the process as a process where somewhere along the line people can be affected emotionally or mentally, if they find some of the skills that they could use appropriately to help people to stay safe and complete that process, then that would be psychological first aid, and they don't have to be a psychiatrist, psychologist, or counselor to do that. So yeah, we can go to the next one. Yeah, but I'll skip that one in the interest of time. Yeah. So to conclude, using this pressure cooker metaphor, we've been able to identify the various stressful aspects in the RSD system, and this stress, which can build up to harm the health of refugee claimants in New Zealand and their ability to present their case meaningfully or in the best way possible. This also results in secondary trauma in the lawyers, decision makers, that is RPO and tribunal members, interpreters, psychologists, psychotherapists, and social workers who work directly with this population group. Drawing from the research participants' perspective, I propose that for the sector, especially the decision makers and the lawyers, or even other professionals that are not the health professionals like psychologists or psychotherapists, social workers, these other professionals could be looking at how they can learn more about this psychological first aid and be able to, so they can provide interventions when needed to be able to help asylum seekers to perform well in the process, meaningfully in the process here. So, and on that note, I would like to thank you all for being here today and to listen to me for this. It's quite a big thing to try to take 100,000-word thesis and bring it down to maybe 20-minute or 30-minute presentation, or maybe I've gone more than that. But for me, the next step, what I'm looking at doing now is that before I mentioned a number of techniques as trauma-informed, techniques that the RSU and IPT could use to interview people, but there's currently no research that has actually written a paper on how interviewing of asylum seekers could be done in a trauma-informed way. No research, or if there is, there's none yet that are found in the context of New Zealand. So that's the next step for me. Is I would like to look at how I can do research that explore really what does it mean when we say this process needs to be trauma-informed, and write maybe an easy, straightforward paper that can help inform decision makers and lawyers how to do that. But then for us as a room, there is a call I would like us to do, maybe a call of action, because that's what I do, advocacy. I think most of you here did, if you were possible to do as an organization or as an individual. The government some months ago successfully reviewed the law on mass arrival, and fantastic submissions, and a lot changed because of the submissions that we did. But actually, that side of the law, or that aspect of the law that they changed, is not what it's been affecting asylum seekers over 3 decades in New Zealand. Because the people that actually ended up in Mount Eden, police cells, are the ones that came individually from the airport or claimed asylum in the country and were taken to these prison facilities. That is what I was expecting them to change first, because that's the one that has affected people, and actually push Amnesty International to do that report with ASST, and many of us here were part of the protest in front of Mount Eden prison to push for that. So it appears that the government has picked that side of the law, to review that aspect of the law. But it's something that we have to look very keenly, as put our eyes to make sure that whatever change they are proposing meets the expectation of New Zealand as a safe place for asylum seekers. So that's the call I would like to make for the group. And with that, I think I'm at the end of my talk, and now time for questions. Thank you for listening. Thank you.